Curious of how to overcome suffering? Well, the Buddha said more than 2,000 years ago that life is suffering. In fact, this is the first truth of the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism. We need not go far and wide to prove Buddha's point. We just need to go within ourselves and be aware of how we have been feeling lately. For example, how frequent have you felt worry, anxiety, anger, hatred, boredom, despair, and the like lately? Or how many times have you hit rock bottom in the past? What about physical pain, financial difficulties? The famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud believes that life is basically suffering, and that the dynamics of nature proves this point. He said, "We are threatened with suffering from three directions: from our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution, and which cannot even do without pain and anxiety; from the external world, which may rage against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction; and finally, from our relation to other men." In fact, the most painful kind of sufferings are those inflicted on us by our own fellow men. Think, for example, of betrayal, insults, or even gossips. Life indeed is full of suffering, and the saddest part is that we cannot do away with it. As a human flesh, we are experiencing suffering of varying degrees on a daily basis. The good thing, however, is that despite the fact that suffering is inevitable, with proper insights and perspective, we can overcome it. And so in what follows, we will address the question, how to overcome suffering. One of the famous contemporary philosophers who attempted to address the question, how to overcome suffering, was Albert Camus. Camus was one of the famous existential thinkers during the second half of the 20th century. He was originally from Algeria but moved to Paris, France during the Second World War. It was during this time that he published his works, which served as a moral guide to the people of France. In fact, he was eventually called by his readers a moralist because of his dedication to protect human rights. Because of his difficult experiences, Camus had gained insights on the role of suffering in human lives and how it could be addressed. Like Buddha, Freud, and many other thinkers, Camus teaches that suffering is inevitable. Camus used the word absurd to describe this condition. The absurdity of life is best captured in the myth of Sisyphus. Camus uses the Greek legend of Sisyphus, who is condemned by the gods for eternity, to repeatedly roll a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll down again once he got it to the top, as a metaphor of the individual's persistent struggle against the essential absurdity in life. This reminds us that each day of our lives, we keep on struggling to survive, yet at the end of it all, everything would be gone. But why suffer? We may wonder if there is any use in living if we are going to lose everything in the end. Here, we may view Camus as nihilistic or a person who does not show value of any sort. However, Camus begs to differ. Even if life is absurd, that is, as meaningless, because it is full of suffering, Camus wants us to keep on searching for meaning in a seemingly meaningless world, because this is where we can find our purpose in living. Thus, for Camus, we need to suffer because suffering is a great teacher in life. It is through suffering, according to Camus, that we can get a perspective of what life is all about. Hence, if we don't face suffering squarely, then we miss the opportunity to attain such insight. Now, how do we face suffering squarely? How can we overcome it? How can we attain meaning in life, if it is attainable at all? Camus offers three alternatives to this problem. You can give up and commit suicide, make a leap of faith, or you can rebel. That is, recognize the absurd, but refuse to let it control your life and happiness. To the first, it would appear that anyone can easily do away with the absurd by committing suicide. However, as already mentioned, for Camus, just because life is absurd, it does not necessarily mean it is not worth living. Despite the fact that life is absurd, Camus believes that life is worth living. Suicide, therefore, cannot be the true alternative to the absurd. In fact, for Camus, suicide is a cowardly act that only attempts to escape the reality of life. Inasmuch as valuing life is living through it despite the sufferings that it harbors, then suicide, as Camus argues, is a devaluation of life. It is nothing but a confession that life is not worth living. To the second, Camus argues that a leap of faith is nothing but philosophical suicide. Philosophical suicide for Camus is the unwillingness to grapple with the very nature of life, including the absurdities that it harbors. It is, therefore, not an acceptable alternative in finding meaning in life. It is because Camus believes that resorting to supernatural solution to the problem of the absurd is a form of escapism, a kind of cowardice no different from physical suicide itself. And so, if suicide and leap of faith cannot be the alternative to the problem of the absurd, what then is the true alternative? Camus argues that the only alternative to the problem of absurdity is to rebel. For Camus, to rebel is to move forward in life. That is, to support life and value it no matter how absurd it may be. In other words, to rebel is to face the absurd squarely. No matter how many times we may have hit rock bottom in life, Camus would have us believe that the only way out is up. As we can see, in Camus' philosophy, the term rebel is used to signify a person who realized that she is suffering, yet she continues to live her life in the best possible way. In other words, a rebel is a person who has overcome suffering by living life to the fullest through the acceptance of the fact that suffering is a necessary part of life. In principle, a person who has accepted the fact that life is suffering will not freak out every time she encounters suffering, but welcome it with complete calmness and joy. In fact, in the myth of Sisyphus, Camus describes Sisyphus's willingness to push the boulder to the top of the hill repeatedly as a kind of happy acceptance of the reality of life, no matter how absurd it may be. As Camus concludes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. For Camus, therefore, this is how to overcome suffering: to recognize and accept the absurd, but refuse to let it control your life and happiness. Indeed, Camus' notion of suffering indicates a positive attitude towards life. It serves as a reminder to everyone that suicide is never an option. This also reminds us that no matter how hopeless the situation is, life remains beautiful. Suffering may be unavoidable, but it should not hinder a person to live her life to the fullest. Indeed, Camus is right when he says that through rebellion, we are able to live life the way we want it to be. That through acceptance of suffering, we would realize that life again remains beautiful and meaningful.